Hello, everyone, and welcome. Um, we're going to get started here. I just want to remind folks I'm going to put something in the chat about questions can be posed using the Q&A feature. Yes, you have to listen to me type this into the chat. Let me just start by saying thank you to everyone for coming. I assume we're going to have a few more people joining us as we move along. This is a brand new format for the JCB, this JCB Reads format, where we invite relatively recent fellows to come and talk about their books. And I'm so happy to have Dr. Tara Bynum kick this event off for us with her wonderful book, Reading Pleasures. Here it is with all my little tabs in here. Um, Everyday Black Living in Early America, fantastic book from the University of Illinois Press, which we will also put the link in the chat directly to the book on the Illinois Press website. So let me first introduce Tara a little bit, and then we're going to get started, and I'll explain a little bit about what we think we're going to do with this format. So Tara Bynum is Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. And she's a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. I have a little bit of bias there on Hopkins. And her work has appeared in early American literature, in Commonplace, J19, African American literature and transition, like a multiple places. And her work has been supported by an incredible number of fantastic institutions, but most importantly, she was a JCB CV Star Center Fellow in 2018-19. So it's fantastic to have Tara here with us with this wonderful book to talk with us about her research and research at the JCB and elsewhere. So what we thought we would do with this relatively brief online only JCB Reads format is pose a series of set questions to our wonderful panelists. So I've got 6 questions. And of course, I will not be able to hold myself to these questions, because you can see I have extra thoughts here. But I'm going to start with a relatively straightforward one, which is, Tara, can you tell us about the origins of this research project?
Well, hello to everyone. And also, thanks so much, Karen, and to the good people at the JCB. My work is certainly indebted to my time there, and I just love having the opportunity to be in conversation with you all today. So I'm super excited and super looking forward to it. So this is a project I always say with many origin stories. Uh, I think that we can kind of connect this back in a very real way to my dissertation. We can also connect it to kind of questions that emerged at the end of my undergraduate experience. So for today, I will say that this project kind of begins for me, like, after reading a Phyllis Wheatley poem in a graduate seminar with Dr. Michael Moon at Johns Hopkins. And I just remember encountering Phyllis Wheatley's thoughts on the works of Providence. And there's a sentence where she says um, that, like, the dreaming lover is sighing or something like that. And I just remember thinking, like, wait, Phyllis, who is this dreaming lover? Like, why are they sighing? What's happening here? And I think that that inquiry sort of began my investigation of my own assumptions. I don't know what I necessarily thought I wanted from Phyllis Wheatley's poems, but I hadn't expected a dreaming lover. I didn't expect that dreaming lover to be sighing. And I guess I started to wonder, like, well, what other expectations do I have of this early African American literature? And um, now that they have been sort of upended, uh, what now is emerging for me? And I started to think a little bit more about, like, pleasure and the possibility of pleasure. So it starts with Phyllis Wheatley. and her poetry, but then with the help of Catherine Clay Bassard, I discover her letters. So there's a whole nother sort of world that opens up for me. And then once I start reading more, then, you've got John Merritt's religious faith, you've got Graniosa's faith in his narrative, and then you've got David Walker's appeal that's also doing something interesting. And like that all kind of begins to work together to like get me thinking. And fast forward, I don't know, almost 20 years, and there was a book.
I love that. I love that. So next on my like rigid list here of questions is about making contributions to scholarship and public conversations, but I can't even go to number two because your answer to number one already prompted other questions. Like, so I wanted to ask, like from the perspective of like a standard issue historian, me, when I think about like Wheatley's poetry or I think about David Walker's appeal, I have to confess that I thought about them in terms of like rigid genres. And I remember people talking about Wheatley in terms of like, oh, you have to read Wheatley in terms of the specific genres, the formalistic genres of the time. And those formalistic genres did not include pleasure and certainly not Black pleasure. So can you talk about like like there's this thing, well, all right, I'm gonna go for something else too. Like there was this thing that Karen Cook Bell said in a review of the book where she talks about she references your references to Black Lives Matter, but she talks about reading with pleasure, joy, and Black living allows us to see the way in which, and she brackets this kind of like not Black Lives Matter, but Black living matters. So I wonder if you could just like talk about that intersection, like assumptions about genre, fencing off somehow pleasure and fencing off like the possibility of Black pleasure in particular.
I think that, um, I think genre does important work to kind of signal to the reader what they are getting into and what they can expect. And um, I think that rigidity ends up being useful in that engagement between author and reader, writer and reader. Um, And I also think that it is the case that even within genre, there are larger possibilities because there kind of have to be. And I think that that is part of what I was like maybe trying to get at and also explore, especially since I also think that like African American cultural production ends up being a genre unto itself. And within that, kind of across time, the expectation is that I think we have to tell a very particular kind of story. And that story is often one that certainly kind of privileges one sort of political status, one's enslavement or pursuit of freedom. And I think it does so at the expense of the possibility of, the full range of human experiences. And I think what I wanted to do was, in some respects, kind of concede to the formal convention. The book talks about poems and letters and narratives and David Walker's appeal. Um, and I think that within those forms, there are sort of rigid expectations for what a letter is supposed to look like, what a narrative is supposed to look like as well. But I think that even within those conventions, there's all manner of feeling and the expression of feeling. And I think that the dreaming lover sighing definitely was like, sure, there's convention, and also there's a 20-year-old woman writing a poem. And within that, she is I don't know, like having all kinds of feelings and experiences that may at times speak to her enslavement, but may at other times speak to her own sort of flights of fancy. And I guess that's what I was most curious about.
Thank you. It's so super interesting. Um, so, so my second question is about what kinds of contributions, and maybe the answer to this is like, that's not what I was thinking about, but um, what kind of contributions you wanted to make to scholarship? How did you want to shift scholarship and scholarly thinking, and public conversations too? Like, were those separate? Or were those the same, basically, the kinds of shifts or contributions that you wanted to make with this book?
So I think that having the opportunity to spend so much time with this book kind of meant that my desires for it changed quite a bit. I think that it certainly begins as a kind of a, both a curiosity that I wanted to pursue and a need. Like I had to write a dissertation to get a PhD. Uh, so there was that. Um, and I think that the deeper I got into this and the more I taught as well, um, I think the more I became invested in kind of pursuing 18th century Black writers in a way that I guess told a story that I hadn't learned and told a story that I also didn't know to think about. I think like, talking about Black people and pleasure, certainly in the 18th century, is tricky. I think that there's a real hesitation, and rightfully so, to do so, because then you end up with folks kind of construing your words, saying that you actually are team slavery when you're not. Um, and I didn't want to write a book that sounded like I was team slavery, like that doesn't make any sense. But I did kind of become more invested, especially when I think about my classroom over the years in kind of helping me and my students understand that people, and Black people in particular, have had access to the full range of human emotion for, I don't know, the entirety of the existence of human beings, despite what their circumstances look like. And I think that's what became really important to me, and kind of wanting to see scholarship that engaged with um, maybe a set of Black experiences that also felt familiar, even if time would suggest otherwise. And if I can just tell a quick story, I had a student recently tell me that human emotions like changed every 20 years. So if you, like, I guess human beings feel completely or have a completely different access to emotion at the 20-year mark. And I was like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this book also operates in response to that. I had to tell the student that I was capable of basic human feelings 20 years ago, and I was certain of that, much to his surprise.
I was waiting for you to do a kind of history of emotions thing, like, the 1780s, click, it's a different kind of thing than the 1760s. And I was totally down for that. I didn't realize the student was literally saying, like, well, when you're 40,
Literally.
okay,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
okay, okay, kids. Um, so what are some surprising things that you came across in your research? And I guess I asked this question because, you started at, well, I mean, this is a standard kind of list of questions, but given that you started by talking about reflecting on this particular line from Wheatley, did you continue to have these kinds of surprising moments in your research where you felt like, I feel astonished by this. I feel validated by this. I feel like this is accumulating for me. Was there a moment where you felt like this is like all of a sudden this is really coming together in a big way? And do you remember some of those? And are there like particular moments that you can, oh, wait, emotionally access?
I think that early on there were so many of them
Mm.
because I was sort of wrestling with my assumptions. So I think that Wheatley's poems end up being kind of chock full of these scenes of like deep affection. So even in the same one, Thoughts on the Works of Providence, you've got the dreaming, loving dreaming lover sighing. You've also got the relationship between love and reason. There's the mention of Aurora and Tython, in Tython's bed. You know, there are a number of these sort of moments, and then kind of actually just realizing that Wheatley has this friendship with Uber Tanner, and then kind of getting into the narratives, like having to wrestle with the reality of Christian faith in a very real way, and kind of making the choice on my part to like not be disappointed that John Marin and Graniosa like believe that Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior, but instead to kind of take it seriously. Like this is their faith, and what does it do for them, and what joy does it bring them, and kind of observing it in a very real and authentic way, and how does it help them order their life story in a way that, you know, on the one hand allows it to fit a particular form, but also kind of reveals what their interests are, what their pleasures are. And then there's, you know, I think in the context of David Walker, just realizing that like there's more happening than an angry man. Like, sure, he's
Right.
angry. And
Yeah.
also that anger is meant to do something for him.
Yeah.
So there were a ton of these moments that all seemed to kind of suggest to me that like I had been taught to think of African American literature in a very narrow kind of way, and a kind of assuming that um, yeah, that experiences were limited, and also um, kind of what early Black writers were thinking about was limited. Those were my assumptions, and I think that kind of there were countless opportunities for me to kind of read that Evans database subject heading Blacks as authors and be surprised like
Mm,
repeatedly. Like, no,
mm,
they are, of course they are engaging with their world. Why would I
mm,
have not thought that? And who am
mm,
I to not think that? Um, yeah, so I it it happens a teeny bit less, or maybe I should say it happens in a different way now. You know, I think I'm still surprised. But I think that the surprise isn't kind of as connected to like my former assumptions about what Black writers could not do.
mm, mm, mm. Can you can you just like going back to the beginning of what you were talking about, can you talk more about that deep friendship with Uber Tanner?
Mm.
And the why that, you know, which you pull out of the letters, but like what a yeah, just talk more about that friendship, which is kind of amazing, that kind of sisters in Christ. And yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. You know, I think realizing, and this happens when I was in graduate school, realizing that there were two Black women writing letters in the 18th century. I definitely remember feeling like my mind is blown.
Mm,
And you know, I think that the more I hung out with historians and the more I learned to think about like dates and things, like the mind
mhm,
blowingness kind of increased, because then it became clear that like these two young women are writing like as a war is emerging, there's political
mm,
upheaval, and yet they're still figuring out how to find each other when they're
mm,
refugees. They're still figuring out how to communicate with one another. And at times they're figuring out how to have deeply mundane sorts of conversations. Um, and I think that there is, you know, I think so much clear delight that they both seem to have in that exchange. And you know, I think the first lesson that I learned from them was certainly like to check my assumption that it would not be possible for them to have this friendship. And even before that, like assuming that Phyllis Wheatley was actually by herself, or like the only.
yeah,
Like I think
yeah,
that that's the tricky thing about the only is that is anyone ever really the only? Like, there are just too many people on Earth. I don't know. That might be a bit more philosophical than we intend here. But, I think that what sort of emerged for me was like Uber Tanner gets me to think about Wheatley within a Black community. And initially, it's only a community that includes Wheatley and Tanner. But I think that since, kind of the earliest iterations of this project, it's become clearer to me that like reading the letters a bit more closely, there's a much larger world that they exist in. And sure,
Mm.
I can only account right now for the letters between Wheatley and Tanner, but I think that within those letters, a whole community emerges, and there's so much more to kind of say about Uber Tanner and Phyllis Wheatley. Um, and I just, I'm a big advocate. Like, let's read the letters more. Like, not necessarily that we have
Mm.
to read the poems less. Like, let's read the letters more and dig in and, kind of make additional sense of what these what these two women are figuring out kind of as they are kind of navigating this emerging war, like at places where the war is also, which I think is important to remember.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's another dimension to the letters that you bring up is that I think is parallel here of like kind of unexpected or unexplored dimensions of Wheatley, where you talk about her marketing
Oh
savvy
yeah.
with and her interest in like where are my books, where are they going to be, and I thought that was super interesting too. And it was another thing that I thought, why didn't I know that? Like, why didn't I think that? We think that about authors. Why didn't I think that about her? I mean, I
Right.
think I know why. Yeah, right, right, because she
I
was supposed to
mean,
be so singular, right?
yeah.
Like a
And
category
also
of one.
like, yeah,
Yeah,
and I think within that, like somehow not capable or somehow not desiring to sell her books. It's like
yeah,
she wrote the books. Like what author doesn't want to sell their books
yeah, right,
in the most
right,
basic way, you know?
right. Yeah, yeah. Well, in that weird way that she gets described in her own time as this like, unusual genius that somehow gets fenced off as this category of like genius that exists outside of all the other permutations of authorship, which is the embodied joy of writing, the embodied joy
Right.
of expression, and the desire to communicate with your readership and to get your work out there, which includes like actually being interested in the financial distribution, the networks of distribution and the finance of authorship. And that's what as I was like kind of rereading the book just quickly this morning, I was thinking like all these weird ways in which that category of one had, kind of fenced all those pieces off. It felt very weird to me. Um, so another question I wondered about work that you used here at the JCB. And of course, my first thought was like, does the text of her work does some work, but did the physical objects of the editions themselves, like because in my I mean, I've gone to, of course, handle our copies of Wheatley's poems, of course, and I've been like, oh, it's amazing object. So I wondered if like that's the kind of work that you did here, and if you had if you have that experience with the object itself, or it's different.
So I think that the handling of the physical objects does a thing. And I think it takes me a while. If I think of like the long origin story of this book to understand the importance of like touching the object. Um, and I think part of what I had to do is realize that, I might actually be into time travel. Um, and like I think part of what helps me get back into the time and the place is, kind of not only being in like the physical space of Providence, which is helpful. Like
Mm,
Wheatley at some point is in the physical space of Providence.
mm.
I don't necessarily know where she stays, but like the JCB and Brown are on the old side of Providence, so she was probably somewhere on College Hill, you know?
In the
Um,
environs, yeah.
yes. So I think that there's that that's really important. And I also think that like where the physical objects help is like having that moment to touch the thing that you know the person touched or
Mm,
had some sort of direct involvement in the production of. And I think what that did for me was, you know, I guess maybe simply put, like ask better questions because I could
mm,
then think about what the like who, what, where better. Um, there's like the hotel that I stay in is whenever I'm in Providence is on the other side of the river. So I end up having to walk up the hill. I hate that hill so much. God, I hate that hill. And
worse in
I
winter.
inevitably, oh,
Yeah,
I can believe it.
yeah.
And I think it's maybe Stephen Hopkins' house that I have end up passing
The
on my
red
way
one.
up the hill. Yes, the red house.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
passed that. And I think like I guess I often think about like I hate that hill. You know, did someone like Wheatley hate that hill? Um, did Caesar Linden hate that hill?
Yeah.
Did Cujo Brown with the dung cart hate that hill? You know, and suddenly
Mm,
it's like, oh, how do you get up that hill if you have asthma and it's December? Or if it's
mm,
February 14th, 1776, and you're writing to Uber Tanner about hanging out. Like, what kind of coat do you have on? Like,
mm,
what,
mm,
yeah, like how are you staying warm? Is it well lit? You know, like
yeah.
it does a thing. And I think holding the objects does something similar as well. And you know, like I said, it takes me a while to figure this out, but I think being in the physical space, um, touching the material objects just sets me up to think more broadly. So I'm no
Mm,
longer, you know, if I think of the earliest iteration of this project, like I'm no longer thinking about like how Phyllis Wheatley learned to read or write,
mm,
but instead asking questions that kind of invite me to think a bit more deeply about her physical world and her engagement with that physical world.
mm, mm. I mean, we think a lot about digitizing here and making JCB materials accessible via digitization. But we also think a lot about the relationship between digital access and affordance and what interaction with the three-dimensional object fires in our neurology. Um, and I wondered if you have thoughts about that or if you talk with students about that, what digital access does versus what encountering the actual object does for your work.
You know, I've thought about it, I'll say less pedagogically and more about the own evolution of my work. Because
Mm,
I think as a graduate student, I had the benefit of having the uh, the databases. You know, I think Hopkins might have been a somewhat early adopter, and I was committed to my Blacks as authors tab, and was like, I never need to go anywhere because it's all here. Um, and so I think that there is something sort of valuable about widespread access and what that opens up and the conversations that that opens up. But I think that what feels important, and I would almost have to reflect a little bit more about like how this begins to click in my own mind, is like helping researchers like understand what can happen when you see the physical object and are in the
mm,
physical space, like realizing that something that you thought was 8.5 by 11 is actually 2.3 by 6 or whatever. Like it's shaped funny, it looks weird. Um, and that might actually matter.
Mhm.
Or even thinking too about like the physical space, the benefit of like having, at least for my research purposes, like the what I'm looking at is in the physical geography of the people that I'm interested in. And, like does the actual physical geography of Providence, for example, or Newport or Boston, like might that be part of the reason why the physical object looks the way that it does?
Mm.
And there was uh, a a project that I was working with a undergraduate student, and I was trying to describe like the physical space of Newport, Rhode Island, and the
Mm.
fact that everything is very close together. And I was like, there's no way to describe that if Iowa City is like the shared geography.
Right.
It does not look
Right.
like
No,
Iowa City at
doesn't
all.
feel at all. Yeah, the
It's not
feeling
the
is so
same.
different.
It's not the
Yeah.
same. Yeah. And that big old
Yeah.
ocean is important
Yeah.
to the story.
Yeah.
And you need to
So
understand
watery.
that, yeah, like there's a big old ocean at the end of the wharf there, or at least the bay that takes you to the big old ocean. And so like how does all of that shape the physical object? And then, it almost feels to me like we need reminders looking at the digital of the fact that like that 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 digitized object is also three-dimensional, and that three-dimensional object has been made in this way because of the physical space that it occupies or occupied at some
Yeah.
point. And I don't necessarily know how to do that, but I do think that it my own sort of ability to sit with that has transformed my research.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I remember the first time after using some of the early newspaper databases, the first time I saw an 18th century newspaper physically, I was like, whoa, that's not like what I thought it would look like. It's
Hmm.
bigger. You know, really super interesting. And just the way the paper wears and the fact
Hmm.
that you can intuit the use and the circulation, all those things that you sort of read about, but it's really different when you're experiencing it. I agree. Um, so I wanted to ask you. I mean, you mentioned Caesar Linden, but I wanted to ask you about what you're working on now, and if you draw connections from reading pleasures to what you're working on now.
So now I am working on a project that I would say is born out of the nuggets that I got to peek at, but
Mhm.
um, couldn't put in reading pleasures. And it has to do with the Rhode Island Black community that is part of Phyllis Wheatley's world. And it is a robust Black community. And it's a robust Black community that leaves behind stuff that has not had um, a ton of engagement. I think that there definitely have been those who uh, have mentioned and talked about some aspects of this community, but I am kind of all the more intrigued by who they are, how they know one another, what they do together. And I don't have a cute pitch just yet, but I absolutely am like, there are stories here about this Black community, and I want to talk about them.
Mm. And you've written about Caesar Linden, and I
Yes.
wondered, like, as I was, I mean, I had just done something where I was citing your work on Caesar Linden. So I was thinking about that and thinking about Caesar Linden's account book and wondering if you feel like there's such a connection between how between his reading and writing pleasures. Like, because I looked at that account book and I thought, like, for those of us who are analog writers and keepers of endless notebooks and feel the soothing qualities of putting something into an orderly notebook. I feel like anybody in the 18th century who's putting stuff into a notebook, I feel instantly I probably am over sort of analyzing that. But I feel like there's a pleasure in that, and I wondered if you connected
Mm.
that.
Um, I think for someone like Caesar Linden, there are multiple sorts of pleasures that I can see in the account book. So, I think that the certainly the kind of orderliness of organizing one's self in life. Um, I also think that like he is recording events, um, even if they might appear to us a bit transactive, that seem pleasurable. Like the pig roast is, a classic one. I was just talking to students about what what that event was, and um, there was, I think because it was the 18th century, they kept using really what they understood to be fancy words to describe it. But at some point, I was like, is it a party? Because that's what
Mhm.
I think it's a party. And we thought about, I was like, there's alcohol, there's food, there's a pig. Um, Party, does that work? So, and it's also couples largely, at least that are part of Caesar Linden's crew there. So like it's a party that includes couples like who are drinking, it sounds like it's probably a good time. I also think about like the mentions of the various marriages. I mean, at some point, there's a woman named Phyllis who has a 32-pound sterling gown. So I also was like, where's Phyllis going in this expensive gown? Like, what? Yeah. I
An
told that
outfit.
to somebody.
Yeah.
There must be an
Yeah.
outfit. That costs as much as the whole pig roast did. So,
Yeah.
like, is she just bejeweled walking around
Mhm. Yeah.
Newport, headed to
Amazing.
what?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So I
I
think that
thought it was,
there's so many instances of pleasure coupled with like the joy of being able to like I don't know, write down one's life and business and keep it ordered in that way.
mm. Do you think about how the way that you're thinking about Caesar Linden's account book, which is at the Rhode Island Historical Society, but I know you've seen Caesar Linden materials here at the JCB as well. Um, but 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 do you think about that in terms of the way that especially Jennifer Morgan, but other people have written about accounting and an accounting um, as a kind of technology of racial capitalism that was so connected to slavery and enslavement. Um, and the way you've written about Caesar Linden's account book is in the service of his expressive and experience life. And I know you think about these tensions a lot about pleasure and enslavement and the kind of wider context and the what we might experience as the dissonance of Black pleasure and also this wider, like a kind of oppressive context. But I wondered if you thought about that in terms of the account book or whether you wanted to talk about that in another way.
So I think what Caesar Linden's account book does for me as well is, and I haven't necessarily talked about this part as much, but it is, I think, a lot of what makes Caesar Linden's account book so um curious to me is that on the one hand, we got Phyllis in her 32-pound gown. We've got the pig roast. On the other hand, Caesar Linden is trading with Newport's biggest slave traders. So if you know anything about Rhode Island slave trading, like Aaron Lopez is in his account book, Christopher Champlin is in his account book, Issachar Pollock is in his account book. Um, yeah, and I think the list sort of we can play this game even more. And I think that what it has done for me is sort of invite a set of questions that I haven't quite had the opportunity to kind of pursue as fully as I would want. But like, what do we make of the Black man who is enslaved with his account book, um, doing doing business not quite as the item sold, but in fact as the accountant who is transacting business. Like, how does that then fit and um fit into the story? And also, like, Caesar Linden can't be the only one as well.
Mm.
So how many other kind of black male accountants, um, black accountants more generally, are there kind of doing this work either throughout Newport, throughout Rhode Island, but also elsewhere? And I had
Mhm.
not even known, like when I first encountered the pig roast, like I hadn't known to think about this as a job. And like once it
Mm.
becomes clear to me that it is a job, like, well, then where does Caesar Linden fit into the story? As he's selling bushels of
Mhm.
beets to Aaron Lopez, like
Yeah.
what, how do, how do we tell that story?
Mm.
And, I think for me, part of the story is like, if you're living in Newport in 1765, this is decidedly normal. Like he's not
Yeah.
doing anything abnormal. So like, how then does that like alter my expectations? How does that help me tell that part of the story better? Um,
Mm.
yeah. So I haven't necessarily come to any conclusions so much as I think Caesar Linden speaks to this tension and also to me like speaks to these roles that simply put kind of seem decidedly messy, at least
Mhm.
based on what I knew to expect, and also like what, of course, in my 21st century, way, like expect Caesar Linden to be doing.
Mm. Mhm. I love how a lot of what you're describing in your own process and thinking is really a reflection of the kind of constraints in some nonetheless fantastically generative scholarship. But nonetheless, what you're saying is like what I expected from all of that work was something different than what I'm encountering in this material. And I suppose that is the great possibility and the great joy of um, scholarly endeavor and what we hope for, to blow our own minds and then to help other people blow their minds too.
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's absolutely right. Like, let's think in new ways.
Yeah, yeah, it's the best, right? So I have one more question for you, but I've got a couple questions from the group. So I'm gonna go ahead and move to those, and then at the last few minutes, I'll do my last question. So one really nice comment on Chaco says, "Thank you for being with us today. My students are also convinced that the pig roast is a party, and we read your wonderful article about Caesar Linden in my course on invisible labor. And it's such a treat to be able to read something that references spaces that are near to us in Providence, and looking forward to the next project." That's more of a comment. That's a really nice comment. Thank you very
Yes.
much. It's fantastic. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right. So Maria, hi Maria, who's one of our current JCB fellows. I found the ideas on the physical object and the physical space fantastic. I wonder if in your book you talk about the very intimate act of reading and writing also in a physical way. Like under what conditions did Phyllis Wheatley read and write? Or what were the material
Mm.
conditions of her reading and writing? And I'm thinking of questions such as how did she procure, even the specifics of how did she procure paper, ink, and books, and so on. And do you imagine her desk?
The Massachusetts Historical Society has a desk that they attribute to Phyllis Wheatley, and I have seen said desk. Um,
What was that like?
so it also was interesting because I realized I'd never thought about how tall or short Phyllis Wheatley was. So I think the
Yeah,
interesting thing about the desk, and it was on a platform, so I didn't get to see how that like the actual height, but it made me wonder, like, I mean, it's a cute desk, but it was it functional? Like, did it turn out
yeah,
Wheatley was 6 feet tall or 4 feet
Yeah, it's
tall
this
or
little
you know.
thing. I'm gonna put it in the chat because it's a small little piece that they put in there, and it's like a little like it looks like a tea table to me. I don't know. What do you think?
Um, I it had a name. I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
Like I think they said what style of table it was, but I can't quite remember. But I think it was interesting for the moment to think about like, oh, I've not given much thought to the physical space that Wheatley took up. And the
Mm,
desk was like the first time of thinking like, oh, well, did the desk fit her? Or did
yeah,
it not? And it's like I don't have
yeah,
the answer to that. But it was interesting to like, oh, this is what furniture does. Furniture can help us, think about those sorts of things as well. Like, was she tall or short? You know?
yeah,
Slim or
yeah,
thick. I don't know. It was
yeah,
interesting. Then made me wonder
yeah,
about the chair. What kind of chair did she
yeah.
have to go
I
with the
think
desk?
I think you need to get up close with that desk. We'll have
Yeah,
to work on
it was
that.
indeed. How about that? Um,
Yeah.
and I think that the question of um kind of Wheatley's experience of reading, I
Mm,
don't necessarily know exactly what it looked like. I know that she ends up going to London and getting a bunch of books. And I think that the closest I get is in the letters when she talks about receiving a letter and kind of delighting in receiving a letter, or knowing that Cato Cogshall brings one of Uber Tanner's letters to her, but she's not home to receive it. I think
mm,
those are moments where I get a little bit of that scene setting.
mm, mm. Yeah, it's great. Jenny Factor adds a point about the desk. It's a folded top card table.
Ah,
So
card table, that's what it
interesting.
was.
Yeah, card table. Interesting.
Thank you, Jenny, for that.
A question from our curator, Jose Montalongo. Jose says, a question about teaching literature. Pleasure can't be mandatory. It would be contradictory to make pleasure mandatory, but an academic course often ends up being a mandatory to-do list. This is a great question, Jose. Typically thoughtful, which includes mandatory readings. Is it possible to teach the reading pleasures? And how do you do that in your classes?
So, one of the interesting things about teaching at Iowa
Mm,
is that I get the opportunity to teach majors, and the
mm,
vast majority of majors want to be writers.
mm,
That doesn't necessarily mean that they want to
mm,
be readers, but they want to be writers. And I think that part of what my kind of responsibility ends up being as um, someone on the kind of uh, critical side of the English house. I'm not a creative writer, I'm a critical writer.
mm,
Um, is to kind of help my students understand like the point of reading is kind of intimately tied to becoming a better writer. And I
mm,
think that that ends up being kind of a way to get them to think more fully and richly about the practice of reading, kind of reading as a practice, and hopefully by way of developing that practice, they will be able to connect to the pleasure of reading and the imaginative exercise that comes with reading, and having that imaginative exercise inform their own writing, how they imagine their voice, and kind of writing out that voice. So that is my hope. We're early in the semester. I'm not sure
mm.
if that will work, but I think that is my thinking, and I do think that that is one of the kind of joys of teaching here is like having access to students who want to be writers, and as a result, kind
Yeah.
of I'm not um, I don't have to convince them that writing is important, even if I still might have to convince them a little bit that reading is.
Now, is that because of the writers' workshop? Do you think that
It is.
is that why? Okay. All right. I just wanted to
Mhm.
okay. Yeah. Cool. That is extremely cool. Of course, I'm also thinking about um, just how much joy it is to read and to write about reading, and just the discipline of reading and note taking. And that goes back to
Mm.
the relationship between that kind of organizational practices and the weird pleasure things that fire in our brains for different things. So keeping a reading journal for me is one of the life's great pleasures. So anyway, I know. Right.
That's
We've all got our things, right?
that's
Um,
indeed me in 18th century cursive. Love it.
ooh.
I love it. I love it.
It's awesome. Who could not
It
love that,
is.
right? Exactly. So my last question for you, Dr. Bynum, is what are you reading now? Speaking of reading.
What am I reading now?
Yeah.
Um, I
Both
think a big
for non-work joy and for work joy, teaching joy, whatever.
so I think I'll lean into the multi-part. I think that there's something that's very, very practical. I'm reading Morgan Parker's book of poems. I think
Ooh.
More Beautiful Than Beyonce or something like that. That's for
Oh,
class.
wow. Okay.
Um, I have been thinking a lot and looking over the footnote in the Massachusetts Historical Society's proceedings that kind of narrate the provenance of Phyllis Wheatley's letters to Uber Tanner. Um, and I think most recently we did this in class. I had my students read Caesar Linden's letter to Moses Brown, um, saying, um, get Prime Brown, who has threatened to kill me, or I'll kill him, basically. Um,
Yeah.
so, you know, I think that's what I've been dilly-dallying in these days.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can't even tell you how much I love that one of your answers about what you're reading is a footnote. That's
I,
the
I feel like this is
best.
a safe space for me to say that. Like the footnote,
It
it's a
is.
long footnote, but it's a footnote
Yeah.
nonetheless. Hmm.
Yeah. Team footnote all the way. Do we have any more questions from the group here? Um, all right. I think we have given people so much joy today. Tara, thank you so much for kicking off the JCB Reads. This has been such a, not to be cliched, such a pleasure for me. Um, such a pleasure for all of us. Really marvelous. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah, thank you as well. This was absolutely delightful. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about my work and of course to talk with you. Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
been a delight.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope the rest of your day is wonderful. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.